Now that my new earpiece translation device was up and running, our productivity was beginning to improve rapidly. The computer department was divided into two groups: hardware and network designers. While the hardware designers were at work putting together the necessary tools to construct computers on par with my own, the network specialists were working on something entirely different.
Our goal
The head network technician began, preening his feathers professionally with his clawed hand.
is to create a decentralized wireless computer network that can securely transmit messages between facilities.
Computers were by no means my specialty, but I took a few coding classes in high school and learned a thing or two about wireless networks from trying to get my dorm room internet to function properly. Nodding along in concurrency with the technician's plan, I waited patiently for my turn to weigh in. So you guys are trying to make an internet?
Could you define internet for us?
Inquired one of the engineers, gazing upon me with even more curiosity than usual. A beautiful and terrible thing, I chuckled wistfully, recalling my numerous adventures into the depths of dreadful data held there. It was originally a project by the US military to create a system that could survive a nuclear blast. Hearing this, the technician's face lit up first with excitement, then confusion.
Originally,
He probed, nudging me to provide an answer for the implicit question therein. It became immensely popular in academic and eventually civilian circles. Strangely enough, the next question posed to me was actually from Chot, whose arm feathers momentarily puffed out with concern.
You say it was both beautiful and terrible. Care to inform us on the latter?
The internet is a treasure trove of information. I began, awaiting the undivided attention of the others before continuing. And any of you who've watched horror movies about cursed artifacts know that not every treasure is good.
meaning
One of the researchers asked nervously, prompting me to continue. Misinformation is easier to spread in a place like that. A word of advice: when social media happens, you're going to need a fact-checking department.
Social? Media?
Chot ponderously parroted the phrase back to himself as though contemplating it.
Care to explain what precisely that is?
Racing through my mental archives in search of an adequate definition, I eventually found and stammered out my best approximation. It's almost like a virtual gathering place. Following Chot's translation, several affirming gestures appeared within the small crowd around me, and so I continued. It lets people from across the world share all sorts of information: pictures, stories, even videos. My explanation was met with no small degree of predictable skepticism from the network engineers. Many of them seemed to think I was exaggerating, but many still seemed overjoyed by the prospect.
Think of how quickly knowledge could be spread.
Began a gray-feathered young female.
but a worldwide network. That's no more than science fiction.
Replied another of the researchers.
We're currently working with an alien life form, and this is what you're having a hard time believing.
She retorted, prompting a light giggle from where Vavi stood to my left. Much as I continued to appreciate their healthy questioning, this conversation seemed to me a waste of time. You know you're not inclined to believe me, right? I snarked, strutting like a peacock to the room's corner and leaning up against a wall. We can talk about the worldwide part of the World Wide Web another day. For now, let's just focus on that web part.
And how do we do that?
The head engineer questioned curiously. Let's start with routers. I began, approaching the table and beginning to sketch out the orthographic view of one. Fortunately for you guys, my router in college was an asshole, so I had to take it apart and put it back together at least 5 times to get the damn thing to work. Given the right substitute parts and a little bit of help, I can most likely build one now. Acceptance of my offer was instant and unanimous. Of all the technologies I'd forgotten to print out blueprints for, routers were one of the biggest. And so, following a short moment spent scrawling a reminder to do that upon my arm, I quickly began listing the parts I would need. Once the other researchers had gathered the basics for me, albeit in their most primitive forms, all that remained was to somehow find a fully functioning CPU. Clearly, I hadn't quite thought this through.
You okay?
Vavi asked, watching with visible concern, as the thought of embarrassing myself in front of and subsequently disappointing a bunch of aliens flooded my veins with cold dread. If there was one thing I hated doing back on Earth, it was making a fool of myself. Unfortunately, if I could identify my greatest talent back on Earth, it would also be making a fool of myself.
If you're suffering some kind of nutrient deficiency, we can retrieve one of those pouches from your ship's storage.
Vavi, you're a genius,
Thank you.
she chirped in reply, continuing on in adorably nerdy length about the biological science of nutrition and how it may differ on other planets in what was clearly a vast misinterpretation of my actual intent. Respectfully awaiting her pause for air before finally resuming my eureka moment, I continued. Don't get me wrong, I do want to hear all about this later, and I hope you'll humor me, but my reaction wasn't about nutrients. Vavi responded with a quiet nod, and, satisfied by the lack of dejection on her face, I continued. My ship's storage room has enough spare parts to rebuild the entire computer 4 times over. Let me just go ahead and grab those.
Not without me, you don't.
Vavi tweeted playfully, rushing after me as I took off down the hall toward my vessel, stopping briefly to inform the guards of our intent before entering the hangar bay. Quickly scampering inside the sleekly designed transport, I gave a brief wave to Holvan, who had been busy scrolling through my ship's surgery nanite function database, before entering the storage room and approaching a wall of lockless lockers on the room's far side, the contents of which, in tandem with my ship's glorified 3D printer fabricator, could be used for all manner of basic repairs. Within these compartments were countless shelves of alphabetically organized parts and wires, the orderly arrangement of which allowing for my quick location and subsequent retrieval of a simple CPU. Here we go. I grinned, turning around to show my companion the exceptionally tiny computer part. This is a central processing unit, or CPU for short. It lets a computer perform multiple different tasks without needing to be rewired. The Kafel woman lowered her gaze from me with something resembling embarrassment.
Would be lying to say I fully understood our own computers, let alone those of humanity.
She concluded with a chuckle, turning around in preparation to begin our return to the lab before craning her neck to look warmly back at me.
But, so, I am glad you're willing to share this. It really means a lot. Sorry I'm not fully getting it.
It's all good, I affirmed placatively, emptying out a small cardboard box of niche supplies and filling it to the brim with any pieces that I didn't think the Kafel could yet properly replicate before then following Vavi out of the storage area. Stepping onto the meager bridge of my vessel and approaching its exit ramp, I paused for a moment to ponder my ship's main terminal. I wonder if any messages from Earth have come in since my arrival here. More so than that, however, I wanted to know what I was supposed to send back. Since my childhood, I've dreamt of humanity finally meeting up with our galactic siblings, but how much will they have changed by the time my message hits home? For all I knew, the humanity who built the UNS Destiny no longer existed. Then again, on the off chance the Kafel were the only aliens close enough for us to meet, it'd be a damn shame if one dumb astronaut stopped our species from ever properly meeting. Stepping down the ramp, I resolved that tonight would be the night I sent my message back home. Let's just hope we've become more like the Federation and less like the Imperium. I nodded grimly to myself. And not the gene-modding tentacled kind of Federation, continued my brain, tagging on the addendum as though the wording of my thoughts somehow mattered. Returning to their lab with a box of alien parts prompted immediate attention from both research halves. And so, placing the box down in the middle of the lab's far wall and giving a brief have-at-it to the computer techs, I grabbed the CPU I'd been looking for in the first place and returned to the group currently attempting to assemble a router. Unlike Chot, who had mostly brushed off my explanation of this CPU, the Kafel who actually knew how computers worked were significantly more impressed. Unfortunately, so much time did I spend responding to their subsequent questions that my allotted segments in the computer department quickly sped past. And so, after making me give my word that I'd return to finish it with them the next day, The scientists bid us a polite thank you and farewell as we made our way toward our next destination, the weapons department. My entrance into the weapons lab was greeted much the same as it had been the day prior, albeit with marginally less stunned silence. Eck's enthusiasm for my presence, however, had yet to fade in the slightest. In fact, if anything, he appeared even more excited to see me than he had been before.
Andrew,
He chirped excitedly, hastily making his way across the floor toward me.
always a pleasure to see our resident extraterrestrial.
Good to see you too, I replied cheerfully, equipping a set of goggles from their nearby repository and making my way down the stairs to greet Eck and his underlings. Anticipation amongst the other workers was palpable as I made my way toward Eck and extended my hand for a shake.
So,
The department head began, grasping my hand within his claws and shaking it up and down in the familiar motion.
you promised yesterday you would get back to us today regarding our newest prototype and your advice on how to proceed.
The room fell near instantaneously into tense silence as the Koffel awaited my judgment regarding their revolutionary prototype. Could you please unload the prototype and bring it out? I asked, deciding it best to take one more look at the machine before implementing my idea. Offering in reply a nod of compliance, Eck gestured to the scientist who had glared at me yesterday and signaled for him to retrieve the gun. Moments later, the figure returned to us bearing in his arms the metal weapon case, setting it upon a nearby workbench and tentatively unlatching its lid. Inside its black foam nest, the Rakasi carnivore looked rather elegant. However, that form was one which belied its suboptimal functions. What's the firing mechanism on this thing? I asked, slapping aside its comically large ammunition cylinder.
It uses compressed air to launch the projectile at significantly faster speeds and deliver nearly twice the force of previous Rakasi models, which were entirely spring-powered.
Interesting. I nodded, turning the gun over in search of its gas canister, before eventually finding it hidden just above the trigger. How many rounds can it fire before the gas needs a reload?
Over 400.
And what are the bullets made of?
Rakasi models these steel bullets coated in lead.
By now finally concluding my idea's efficacy, I decided the time had come to test it out. You guys think you can all wait here for an hour or two while I take a quick trip back to my vessel? Following their unanimous mumbling of agreement, I quickly turned around and once again jogged back to the Destiny. Nobody was inside the ship when I got there, which was fortunate given my objective. Quickly striding over to my computer and opening up its technology database, I quickly began searching for the item I needed. Warning: you are attempting to access materials marked as a Class 1 danger to your health and safety. Please wait here while the 12-hour waiting period subsides. Rolling my eyes at the annoyance, I quickly accessed the commands and typed in the secret bypass code. Red Scissors 123, showing results for airsoft rifle. Bingo! I grinned, scrolling through the long list of armaments before finally landing upon one with the proper dimensions. Then, uploading the blueprint to a 3D modeling software, I quickly got to work adding in the necessary improvements. Remove the recoil simulator, modify the dimensions a bit, up the power, add in some extra recoil suppressant, a few mods here and there, and, after 2 hours, the new prototype was finally done. Hovering my cursor over the options menu, I quickly navigated to the printing segment and uploading the file to my fabricator, clicked Start. Printing 0% finished. Please wait. Estimated time to completion 5 hours. Heaving out a sigh of frustration with regards to that obscene waiting period, I stood from my chair and, internally rehearsing my apology for it, quickly set off back to the lab where Vavi, Chot, and Eck were awaiting me. On my way to the Destiny, and for much of my journey back, this hallway had been a quiet location. Now, however, nearing the end of the return trip, I heard shouting in the distance. Zintra's shrieks of, "He's getting away," and "Someone call a doctor," radiated out from the direction I had initially come. Soon, my path of return had come to a crossroads, and sprinting down from the left hall, where my objective was to be found, came that strange Kaffel before, who had been assigned to retrieve the prototype. The The gun was once again resting in his hands, but the way he held it this time most certainly wasn't up to safety protocols.
Damned heathens found me out.
The stranger seethed loudly, so caught up in his woes that he was yet to notice my presence in front of him, frozen in fear upon the realization of what this was.
I'll have to steal one of their planes at the hangar bay. Then I can...
He shrieked, visibly terrified by my presence blocking his path.
Move, demon!
The Providence spy stammered, aiming the weapon at my forehead as I could only watch, paralyzed by my own accursed indecision. This spy, however, seemed to possess no such hesitation. Instead, his clawed finger quickly pulled back on the trigger, sending the deadly projectile sailing directly into my head.
Thank you for watching. Like, share and subscribe for more original content. New chapters and standalone stories uploaded weekly.